This is what showed up on Reddit just a few days ago in January 2026. The kind of footage that makes your stomach drop and your hands shake when you're watching it. Before I get into it, I need to give you some background because this isn't just about two random trail camera clips. This is about a place that's been at the center of this whole mystery for almost 60 years. A place where history was made, where the most famous Bigfoot footage ever recorded was shot, and where people have been seeing these things ever since. Bluff Creek, California. I grew up hearing about the Bigfoot in our area, not from TV or books, but from family. My uncle spent most of his life working in the forests around Northern California, doing timber surveys and trail maintenance deep in places where most people never go. He wasn't the type to make things up or exaggerate. In fact, he was probably one of the most practical, no-nonsense guys I've ever known. The kind of person who wouldn't believe in Bigfoot if you'd asked him before it happened. It was sometime in the late 1980s when he had his encounter, and he only told the family about it once, at a gathering maybe 15 years back. He didn't bring it up. Someone else mentioned seeing something strange on a camping trip, and that opened the door for him to share. Even then, he was hesitant, like he was worried we'd laugh at him. He said he was doing a survey about 40 miles into the Six Rivers National Forest, working alone because that's how he preferred it. It was late afternoon, and he was finishing up for the day, marking trees and taking notes on his clipboard. The forest was quiet. Too quiet, he said, which should have been his first warning. No birds, no squirrels rustling in the branches, nothing. Just dead silence. Then he heard it. A branch snapped somewhere behind him, loud enough that it had to be something big. He turned around expecting to see a bear. They were common in that area, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. He went back to his work, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. You know that sensation when the hair on the back of your neck stands up and every instinct is screaming that something's wrong? That's what he was feeling. A few minutes later, it happened again. Another crack of a branch, this time closer. He spun around and caught movement, something massive ducking behind a cluster of pines about 50 yards away. He called out, thinking maybe it was another surveyor or a lost hiker, but there was no response. Just that terrible silence again. My uncle decided he'd had enough. He packed up his gear quickly and started heading back toward his truck, which was about a mile away on an old logging road. As he walked, he kept hearing footsteps paralleling his path through the trees. Heavy footsteps, deliberate, keeping pace with him. Whatever it was stayed just out of sight, moving through the underbrush like it knew exactly how to remain hidden. The thing that really got to him, he said, was when he stopped to catch his breath. The footsteps stopped too. When he started moving again, they resumed. It was following him, and it was smart enough to mirror his movements. That's when real fear set in. Not panic, but a deep, primal dread that told him he was being stalked by something that understood what it was doing. Finally, maybe a quarter-mile from his truck, he got his only clear look at it. The Bigfoot stepped out from behind a massive redwood just for a second, almost like it wanted him to see it. He described it as being at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair that looked matted and thick, with shoulders so broad it didn't look real. The arms hung down past where a person's arm should end, and the way it moved, fluid, powerful, completely at ease in that terrain, wasn't like any bear or person he'd ever seen. They locked eyes for maybe 3 seconds, and my uncle said the look on the Bigfoot's face wasn't aggressive or curious. It was more like assessment, like the Bigfoot was deciding whether he was a threat or not. Then it turned and walked away, disappearing into the forest without making a sound. No crashing through the brush, no noise at all. Just gone. He made it back to his truck and didn't do any more solo surveys in that area. When he told us the story, his hands were shaking a little, even though it had been decades. Someone asked him why he never reported it or tried to get proof, and he just shook his head. He said he felt like the Bigfoot had let him leave, like it could have done something if it wanted to, and he didn't want to push his luck by going back. That story stuck with me for years, not because it was dramatic or scary, but because of who told it. My uncle wasn't the type to spin tales or seek attention. If anything, sharing that story seemed to embarrass him, like he was admitting to something he still couldn't fully explain. And that's what makes these encounters so frustrating. The best witnesses are often the ones who never wanted to talk about it in the first place. Now, to understand why the footage matters so much, you need to know about the Patterson-Gimlin film. If you've spent any time looking into Bigfoot, you've seen it. The 59.5 seconds of shaky 16mm film shot in October 1967 at Bluff Creek in Northern California. It shows a large, hairy bipedal creature walking along a creek bed, turning to look at the camera briefly, then continuing into the forest. For almost 60 years, that film has been the gold standard. People have analyzed it frame by frame, argued about whether it's a man in a suit, debated the gait and proportions and muscle movements. Hollywood costume designers have said they couldn't replicate the suit even with modern technology. Others have sworn it's a hoax. The debate has never really ended. What's interesting is that Bluff Creek itself has remained a hotspot. People still report seeing Bigfoot in that area. Hikers talk about finding enormous footprints near the creek. Campers hear strange vocalizations echoing through the valleys at night, deep, resonant calls that don't match any known animal. The place has a reputation, and people who live nearby will tell you that something is out there, even if they don't want to come right out and say it's Bigfoot. I've talked to locals over the years. Gas station attendants, motel clerks, people working in the small towns near the Six Rivers National Forest. Most won't volunteer information, but if you ask the right questions and show genuine interest rather than mockery, they'll open up a little. They'll mention a cousin who saw something crossing a logging road at dawn, a friend who found a tree structure that couldn't have been made by humans, strange sounds recorded on hunting cameras that never captured an image of what made them. The common thread in all these accounts is how elusive the Bigfoot is. These things don't want to be seen. They move through the forest like ghosts, leaving just enough evidence to make you wonder, but never enough to prove anything. Trail cameras mysteriously stop working when something big approaches. Footprints appear in mud, but lead to rocky areas where they can't be tracked. It's like they understand technology and know how to avoid it. There's this one story I heard from an older woman who ran a small grocery store in Happy Camp, not far from Bluff Creek. She told me her grandfather used to trap in those mountains back in the 1940s, long before the Patterson-Gimlin film. He would set traps for marten and beaver, checking them every few days. On multiple occasions, he'd find his trap sprung, but the bait gone. Yet the trap itself hadn't caught anything. No animal tracks around, no signs of what had triggered it. One time he found something that really bothered him. One of his larger traps, meant for bigger game, had been completely dismantled. Not by a bear or mountain lion, they would have just tripped it and run. Someone or something had systematically taken it apart, piece by piece, and stacked the components in a neat pile nearby. The chain that anchored it to a tree had been unwound. The trigger mechanism had been separated from the jaws. He said it looked like someone with hands had examined the trap, figured out how it worked, and disabled it permanently. After that, he started noticing other things. Trees knocked down across his usual paths like something was trying to block his roots. Large rocks placed deliberately in spots where he normally walked. He felt watched constantly. Eventually, he stopped going into that particular area altogether, even though it was some of the best trapping territory he knew. When his granddaughter asked him why, he just said there were things in those mountains that didn't want him there, and he was smart enough to listen. The woman who told me the story had her own experience years later when she was a teenager in the 1970s. She and some friends had gone camping near a place called Fish Lake, which sits in a remote valley about 30 miles from Bluff Creek. They'd set up their tents in the early afternoon and spent the day swimming and exploring the area. Everything seemed normal until the sun started going down. They'd built a fire and were cooking dinner when one of her friends pointed out that the forest had gone completely silent. No crickets, no owls, no rustling in the bushes, just an oppressive quiet that made everyone uneasy. Then they heard it, a sound she described as being somewhere between a howl and a scream, echoing across the lake from the opposite shore. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, this drawn-out vocalization that didn't sound like any animal they knew. One of the guys in the group, trying to be brave, shouted back across the lake. Big mistake. Within seconds, they heard heavy footsteps in the tree line behind their camp, maybe 50 yards away. Something big was pacing back and forth, staying just out of sight in the darkness. They could hear branches snapping, vegetation being pushed aside. Whatever it was making no attempt to be quiet anymore. The group made a decision fast. They weren't staying the night. They threw everything they could grab into their cars and got out of there, leaving the tents standing because no one wanted to get any closer to the tree line to take them down. As they were driving away on the rough forest road, their headlights caught something standing at the edge of the clearing. She only got a glimpse, but she said it was massive, upright, and covered in dark hair. It didn't move toward them or away, just stood there watching as they left. They came back 2 days later to get their tents, bringing more people and arriving in full daylight. The tents were still standing, but they'd been disturbed. One had a hole torn in the side, and another had been partially collapsed. Their cooler, which they'd left behind in the rush, had been opened. Not smashed or chewed through, but opened, with the lid removed and set aside. The food inside was gone. Footprints in the soft ground around the campsite showed something with feet at least twice the size of a human's had been walking around. What struck her most was that nothing had been destroyed. A bear would have shredded the tents completely trying to get to food. A raccoon or other scavenger would have left evidence of tearing and biting. But this looked like someone had methodically investigated their belongings, taken what they wanted, and left everything else relatively intact. The level of control suggested intelligence and intention, not animal instinct. Stories like this go back generations in that region. The Karuk and Yurok people who are native to that area have their own accounts of the Bigfoot, which they call by different names depending on the clan and location. They describe them as forest guardians, beings that stay hidden, but sometimes make themselves known to deliver warnings or protect the land. They talk about hearing wood knocks echoing through the canyons, sharp, intentional sounds made by striking trees with branches or rocks, a form of communication between the Bigfoot. The point is, the Patterson-Gimlin film didn't come out of nowhere. It was shot in a place where sightings had been reported for decades by people who had no reason to lie. It captured something that locals already knew was out there, and ever since then, Bluff Creek has remained active. The Bigfoot never left. So here's where things get interesting. We are looking at 2 remarkable pieces of footage that have recently surfaced from a Reddit user, timestamped just days ago in January 2026. These were reportedly captured by trail cameras set up in the same area in Bluff Creek, California, within the 6 Rivers National Forest. But these 2 pieces of footage offer perhaps the most lucid look at this subject we have ever seen. In the first sequence, we observe a massive, bipedal subject moving through the timber. The first thing to note is the sheer density of the creature. This isn't just tall, it is incredibly thick through the torso and chest, indicating a lung capacity and skeletal structure built for high altitude or rugged terrain survival. Analyze the locomotion here. You'll notice the arms are hanging exceptionally low, reaching well past the mid-thigh. This is a key anatomical marker often cited in hominid research. When it walks, there is a distinct fluidity, a compliant gait, where the knees stay bent to absorb the impact of its weight. A human in a suit typically bobs up and down with each step, but this figure's head remains relatively level, gliding across the uneven ground with a grace that contradicts its immense size. The second clip, however, provides forensic details that are usually impossible to see. We are getting a direct view of the face through the foliage. Look at the cranial structure. We see a pronounced sagittal crest, that cone-shaped peak at the top of the head. In biological terms, this ridge exists to anchor powerful temporalis muscles, suggesting this animal possesses a jaw strength significantly greater than a human's, capable of grinding tough vegetation or crushing bone. Focus on the skin around the face. It is dark, leathery, and deeply textured, contrasting sharply with the reddish-brown pelage that covers the rest of the body. The nose is flat and broad, a feature common in great apes, distinct from the protruding nasal bridge of modern humans. But it is the eyes that are most compelling. They are deep-set beneath a heavy brow ridge, yet they show a distinct focus and intelligence. It appears to be assessing the camera, not with the flight instinct of a deer, but with the curiosity of an apex predator. If these clips are authentic, they present a consistent biological profile, a large, unclassified primate adapted to the North American wilderness. The consistency in hair color, body mass, and facial structure between the two angles suggests we are looking at a living, breathing animal, finally stepping out of the realm of myth and into the focus of a lens. Now, I know what you're thinking. Could this be faked? Sure, anything can be faked these days. But here's what strikes me as different about these clips. They weren't posted with fanfare or dramatic commentary. The person who shared them didn't make wild claims or try to profit from them. They just said they had trail cameras in the area, checked the footage, and found this. The timestamps and location data embedded in the files match the story. And most importantly, the Bigfoot in the footage behaves exactly how witnesses have described for decades. Watch how it moves in the first clip. It's not rushing, not acting startled. It's just walking through the forest like it belongs there, which it does. The way it navigates around trees and over uneven ground shows familiarity with the terrain. This isn't some person in a costume stumbling through unfamiliar woods trying not to trip. This is something that lives there. And that second clip, with the face visible through the branches, that's what really gets me. The detail is extraordinary. You can see the texture of the skin, the way the hair lies flat in some places and stands up in others, the subtle movements of the facial muscles. If that's a costume, it's the most sophisticated costume ever created, deployed in a random forest location with apparently no crew or support, triggered by a trail camera that the hoaxer somehow knew the exact position of. Let me put this in perspective. Trail cameras are everywhere now. Hunters use them, wildlife biologists use them, property owners use them to monitor their land. They're motion activated and can sit in the woods for weeks at a time, capturing whatever passes by. The reason we're finally getting better Bigfoot footage isn't because the Bigfoot are becoming less elusive. It's because we've blanketed their habitat with cameras. Think about it. For decades, if you wanted to film a Bigfoot, you had to be in the right place at the right time with a camera in your hand. The odds of that happening were astronomical. But now we have thousands of cameras sitting silently in the woods, waiting. Eventually, the Bigfoot is going to walk past one, And when it does, we get clips like this. Here's where things get frustrating. You'd think footage like this would prompt some kind of official response. Wildlife agencies, universities, somebody should be interested in investigating this, right? But that's not what happens. Instead, there's silence, or worse, dismissal without examination. I've thought about this a lot over the years, trying to understand why there's such resistance to even looking at the evidence. Part of it is reputational. No wildlife biologist wants to be known as the Bigfoot person. It's career suicide in the academic world. You can study the most obscure beetle species or spend years tracking a particular population of salamanders and get grants and respect. But suggest that an unknown primate might exist in North America, you're labeled a crank. There's also the problem of admission. If government agencies acknowledge that Bigfoot might exist, they have to explain why they haven't been studying it all this time. They have to answer questions about why they've ignored thousands of reported sightings. They have to justify decades of doing nothing while witnesses were dismissed and mocked. It's easier to maintain the status quo and pretend the evidence doesn't exist. And then there's the practical side. If Bigfoot is confirmed to exist, what happens next? Do they become protected? Do vast areas of forest become restricted to human activity to preserve their habitat? What about logging operations, mining interests, development projects? There are serious economic implications to acknowledging that a previously unknown large primate is living in our national forests. I'm not saying there's some grand conspiracy to hide the truth about Bigfoot. I think it's more mundane than that. It's institutional inertia, academic gatekeeping, and economic interests all combining to create a situation where no one in an official capacity wants to touch this topic. So sightings get filed away, footage gets ignored, and witnesses get told they saw a bear or misidentified something else. I talked to a forestry ranger once, off the record, who told me they'd seen a Bigfoot twice while working in the Cascade Range. Both times he filed reports with his supervisor. Both times he was told not to mention it to anyone else, and the reports disappeared. When I asked him why he thought that happened, he said it was because acknowledging Bigfoot would create too many complications. It's easier to pretend they don't exist. He elaborated on what those complications might look like. If a federal agency confirms that an unknown primate species exists in national forests, they immediately become responsible for its conservation and management. Environmental impact studies would need to be conducted for every logging operation, road construction project, and development plan in potential Bigfoot habitat. That's hundreds of square miles of forest where current economic activities might face new restrictions. Think about the Pacific Northwest timber industry, which is already controversial and heavily regulated. Now imagine telling logging companies that they need to factor in the presence of Bigfoot when planning operations. Imagine the legal battles, the environmental reviews, the costs. Companies would fight it every step of the way, and they have resources and political influence to make that fight expensive and drawn out. Then there's the tourism aspect, which cuts both ways. On one hand, confirming Bigfoot would create an explosion of interest in certain areas. On the other hand, it might lead to restrictions on where people can hike, camp, and hunt. The outdoor recreation industry is massive in the western states, generating billions in revenue. Any threat to that access, even in the name of protecting an endangered species, would face fierce opposition. The ranger also mentioned something I hadn't considered: the safety liability issue. If a government agency acknowledges that potentially dangerous large primates live in public forests, they become liable if someone gets hurt. Right now, if a hiker has a scary encounter or gets injured in a confrontation with something unknown, the agency can say it was probably a bear and file it away. But if they've officially recognized Bigfoot exists, that changes everything from a legal standpoint. There's also the scientific establishment to consider. Academic institutions have spent decades dismissing Bigfoot as pseudoscience. Researchers have built careers on the assumption that all large North American mammals have been cataloged. If Bigfoot turns out to be real, it invalidates a lot of established thinking about wildlife populations, habitat capacity, and species distribution. That's embarrassing for people who've been confidently stating these things don't exist. I've seen how this plays out when credible witnesses come forward. A biologist working for a state wildlife agency encounters a Bigfoot while conducting a field survey. They know what they saw, but they also know that reporting it officially will damage their professional reputation. So they file a generic report about unusual wildlife activity, maybe mention it to trusted colleagues privately, but never go on record with a full account. The system is set up to discourage exactly the kind of documentation we need. One wildlife biologist I spoke with, who requested complete anonymity, told me about an incident that really illustrates the problem. Her team was doing a population study of black bears in a remote area of the Olympic National Forest. They'd set up motion-triggered cameras at intervals along a creek drainage known to be a travel corridor for bears. Over a 3-month period, they captured hundreds of images of bears as expected. But one camera, positioned at a particularly isolated spot about 6 miles from the nearest trail, captured something else. The image sequence showed what appeared to be a large, upright figure approaching the camera in the pre-dawn darkness. The figure was heavily built, covered in dark hair, and moving on 2 legs with a distinctly non-human gait. The camera captured 4 frames before the subject apparently noticed it and moved out of view. When the team reviewed the footage back at their office, there was immediate disagreement about what to do. Some wanted to document it officially and investigate further. Others argued it would contaminate the bear study data and make their whole project look ridiculous. The lead researcher made the decision to exclude those images from the official record and not mention them in their report. The biologist I talked to kept copies of the images, but they've never been made public or submitted for analysis. She told me this happens more than people realize. Researchers working in remote areas occasionally capture images or have encounters that don't fit into accepted categories. But the academic and professional pressure to conform is so strong that most evidence gets buried or explained away. She estimated that for every Bigfoot sighting that gets reported publicly, there might be 10 or 20 that happen to people working in the field who choose to stay silent. The frustrating part is that we have all the tools we'd need to conduct a proper investigation. Modern camera technology, DNA analysis, acoustic monitoring equipment, satellite tracking. If these resources were applied systematically in known hotspot areas, we'd likely have definitive answers within a few years. But that requires institutional support and funding, which requires official acknowledgement that the question is worth investigating, and that's where everything breaks down. The frustrating thing is that the evidence keeps accumulating. Footprint casts that show dermal ridges and anatomical details you can't fake. Audio recordings of vocalizations that don't match any known animal in North America. Thousands of eyewitness accounts from credible people, police officers, forest rangers, hunters, hikers, who have nothing to gain and everything to lose by speaking up. And now, footage like what just appeared on Reddit, showing details that should prompt serious investigation, but nothing happens. The footage gets analyzed by people online, debated endlessly, and then fades from attention when the next viral video comes along. Meanwhile, somewhere in the forests of Northern California, the Bigfoot that was captured on those trail cameras is still out there, going about its life completely unaware of the debate it sparked. What makes the Bigfoot phenomenon so compelling isn't just the modern evidence, it's how deep the roots go Every culture that has lived in forested regions has stories of wild men, forest giants, beings that bridge the gap between human and animal. The Native American tribes of the Pacific Northwest have been telling these stories for thousands of years, long before anyone thought to call them Bigfoot or Sasquatch. The Lummi people speak of Tisemekwes, a giant covered in hair who lives in the high mountains and whistles to communicate. The Spokane tell stories of Skanikum, wild men of the woods who steal food but generally avoid humans. The Yakama know them as the Stick Indians, beings who live in the deep forest and mark their territory by breaking trees. These aren't recent inventions or stories borrowed from white settlers. They're part of the cultural foundation of these peoples, passed down through generations. When Europeans first arrived in the Pacific Northwest, they documented similar accounts from the indigenous populations. But they also started having their own encounters. Fur trappers in the 1800s reported seeing massive, hair-covered figures in the forests. Gold prospectors in British Columbia told stories of enormous footprints found near their camps. The Ape Canyon incident of 1924, where a group of miners claimed they were attacked by several Bigfoot, made national news at the time. What strikes me about these old accounts is their consistency. People separated by decades or even centuries who had no contact with each other describe the same basic creature, something tall and broad, covered in hair, walking upright, living in remote forests, and avoiding human contact. The details might vary. Some describe them as aggressive, others as shy. Some say they smell terrible. Others mention nothing about odor. But the core description remains remarkably stable. One story that always stuck with me came from an old-timer who lived near the Oregon-California border. He was in his 80s when I talked to him, so his memory of the event stretched back to the 1950s when he was a teenager working at a lumber camp during the summer. The camp was deep in the mountains, miles from the nearest town, and the crew would stay there for weeks at a time before getting a weekend off to go back to civilization. One night, he and another young worker were smoking cigarettes outside the bunkhouse when they heard something moving in the trees at the edge of the clearing. It was late, well after dark, and most of the crew was already asleep. At first, they thought it was a bear nosing around the camp looking for food scraps, which happened occasionally. But then they heard something that made them freeze, a low, gurgling sound that turned into a high-pitched whistle. The other kid wanted to go back inside immediately, but he was curious, maybe too curious for his own good. He grabbed a flashlight and started walking toward the tree line. As he got closer, he could hear heavy breathing, deep and rhythmic. Then the flashlight beam caught something, just for a second, a face, or what looked like a face, peering at him from behind a tree trunk about 15 feet up. The face was dark, flat, with eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. He stumbled backward and dropped the flashlight, and whatever it was moved. Not away, but around the tree, like it was repositioning to keep watching him. The other kid was yelling at him to run, and he finally did, both of them sprinting back to the bunkhouse and slamming the door behind them. They told the foreman about it the next morning, and he just laughed and said they'd seen a bear. But the old man insisted, even 60 years later, that it wasn't a bear. Bears don't climb that high and watch you with intelligent eyes. Bears don't whistle. The interesting thing about that story is what happened afterward. The foreman might have dismissed it, but several of the older loggers pulled the two kids aside later and told them they believed them. They'd seen things too, heard things, found evidence around the camp that didn't add up. One of them showed them a footprint he'd found a few weeks earlier, pressed deep into mud near a stream, at least 18 inches long and clearly showing 5 toes. He'd taken a photograph of it before the rain washed it away, and he kept that photograph in his wallet. That's the thing about these encounters. They're rarely isolated. One person sees something and thinks they're going crazy, then finds out half the camp has had similar experiences, but no one wanted to be the first to say anything. The Bigfoot are part of the landscape in these remote areas, known but not spoken about, acknowledged privately but denied publicly. I've collected dozens of these stories over the years, and they paint a picture of creatures that are deeply integrated into the forest ecosystems. They're not random visitors or anomalies, they're residents with territories and patterns of behavior. They avoid humans when possible, but will defend their space if pushed. They're curious about us, but wary. They're intelligent enough to understand threats and adapt their behavior accordingly. The folklore isn't just stories, it's accumulated observations from thousands of years of human presence in these forests, passed down and refined through generations. When the Yakima talk about the Bigfoot throwing rocks to warn people away from certain areas, that matches what modern witnesses report. When the Lummi describe whistling communication, that aligns with audio recordings captured today. The folklore and the current evidence support each other, and that's what makes it so compelling. I spent time researching these traditional accounts, and what's interesting is how specific they are about Bigfoot behavior. The Salish people of British Columbia talk about the Bigfoot being most active during the salmon runs when they come down from the high country to fish alongside bears. This makes ecological sense. A large omnivore would need seasonal food sources, and salmon provide concentrated protein during specific times of the year. The Klamath tribe, whose traditional territory includes areas around Crater Lake in Oregon, describe the Bigfoot as being territorial but not unnecessarily aggressive. They tell stories of hunters who accidentally wandered into Bigfoot territory and were warned away with rock throwing, tree shaking, and aggressive vocalizations. But the Bigfoot didn't attack. They just made it very clear the hunters weren't welcome. This pattern of intimidation rather than violence appears consistently in modern encounters as well. There's also the recurring theme of Bigfoot as a shapeshifter or spirit being in some tribal traditions. While this might sound like pure mythology, it could reflect observations of how effectively these creatures can disappear into the landscape. To someone without a modern understanding of camouflage and natural concealment, watching a Bigfoot seemingly vanish into the forest might look like transformation or supernatural ability. The practical reality of excellent stealth gets interpreted through a spiritual lens. I remember talking to an elder from one of the Northern California tribes at a cultural event a few years ago. He was hesitant to discuss the Bigfoot at first, saying it wasn't appropriate to share certain knowledge with outsiders, but when I mentioned my uncle's encounter, his attitude shifted. He said if the Bigfoot had chosen to reveal itself to my family, then maybe we were meant to understand something about them. He told me that in his tradition, the Bigfoot are considered to be the original people of the mountains, here long before humans arrived. They're respected as fellow inhabitants of the land, not animals to be hunted or studied. When his people encounter Bigfoot, they acknowledge them respectfully and move on. There's no attempt to pursue them, photograph them, or prove their existence to others. The relationship is based on mutual coexistence and privacy. This attitude explains something that's always puzzled me about Bigfoot encounters in tribal communities. There are countless stories, generations of consistent reports, but very few attempts at documentation. It's not because they don't believe the Bigfoot are real. It's because trying to prove their existence to skeptical outsiders would violate the respectful relationship they've maintained for centuries. The Bigfoot want to be left alone, and traditional knowledge honors that preference. The elder also mentioned something that stuck with me. He said the Bigfoot have been moving deeper into the wilderness over time, retreating from areas that are becoming too populated or developed. Places where encounters were common 50 years ago are now quiet. The Bigfoot remember, he said, and they adapt. They've watched human expansion and learned to avoid it, moving to more remote areas where they're less likely to be disturbed. This matches demographic patterns in reported sightings. The hotspots have shifted over the decades. Areas that had frequent encounters in the 1970s and 1980s might go quiet in the 2000s as development encroaches, while more remote regions start seeing increased activity. The Bigfoot aren't disappearing. They're relocating, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain to find new sanctuary away from human presence. European settlers in the 1800s and early 1900s also documented encounters, though they interpreted them through their own cultural lens. The famous Bauman story, told to Theodore Roosevelt and published in his 1893 book, The Wilderness Hunter, describes an incident where a trapper was stalked and his partner killed by something the survivor described as neither man nor bear. The story is chilling in its details. The methodical stalking, the calculated timing of the attack, the enormous footprints found around the campsite. Roosevelt himself noted that the story had the ring of truth to it, despite its fantastic nature. He'd spent enough time in the wilderness to know what was possible and what wasn't, and while he didn't commit to believing in the creature, he didn't dismiss the account either. For Roosevelt to include it in his book suggests he found it credible enough to warrant documentation, even if he couldn't explain what had actually happened. One of the biggest arguments against Bigfoot is simple. If they exist, why don't we have better evidence? Why aren't there more clear photographs, more bodies, more proof? It's a fair question, and the answer comes down to just how incredibly reclusive these things are. A friend of mine who used to work as a hunting guide in Washington State told me something that changed how I thought about this. He'd spent 30 years in the mountains, guiding clients through some of the most remote terrain in the state. In all that time, he'd only seen a mountain lion in the wild twice, just twice, despite spending literally thousands of days in their habitat. He'd found tracks, heard screams, seen evidence of kills, but actual sightings? Extremely rare. Mountain lions are confirmed to exist. We have populations in every western state. We've studied their behavior extensively. We've tagged and tracked them. And yet they're so elusive that most people who live in mountain lion country will never see one in their entire lives. If a known predator can be that good at avoiding humans, imagine how successful an intelligent primate that actively doesn't want to be seen could be. The Bigfoot aren't just hiding, they're actively managing their visibility. Witnesses consistently report behavior that suggests awareness and avoidance strategies. They move at dawn and dusk when human activity is lowest. They use terrain features to stay out of sight, moving through valleys and creek beds where they're below sight lines. They break branches and knock on trees to communicate with each other, warning about human presence. They're nocturnal when they need to be, staying hidden during daylight hours and only coming out when darkness provides cover. I heard about one case that really illustrated this from a wildlife photographer who specializes in bears. He'd set up a camera trap system in a creek drainage where bears regularly fish for salmon. He had cameras positioned every 50 yards along a 3-mile stretch of creek, all running continuously during the salmon run. The cameras captured hundreds of images of bears, wolves, deer, even wolverines passing through the area. But one morning when he was checking the cameras, he found something odd. 3 cameras in a row had all stopped recording at almost the same time, within a 5-minute window around 3 in the morning. Not because the batteries died or the memory cards filled up, they just stopped. When he brought them back and checked the footage, each camera had captured something similar in its final frames. A large, dark shape approaching, the frame going momentarily black like something had covered the lens, then nothing. He returned to the site and found all 3 cameras had been moved. Not damaged, not stolen, moved. They'd been taken off their mounting straps, turned to face away from the creek, and placed carefully on the ground. Whatever did it, had enough intelligence to understand what the cameras were, enough manual dexterity to dismount them without breaking them, and enough patience to systematically disable 3 devices in sequence. The photographer told me he reset the cameras but never got any useful footage from that drainage again that season. Bears kept using it, other wildlife came and went, but the cameras kept mysteriously failing or getting covered by branches at crucial moments. He eventually moved his setup to a different watershed. When I asked him what he thought had disabled his cameras, he didn't want to speculate on record, but privately, he said he thought it was a Bigfoot that had learned to identify and avoid camera traps. Stories like this come up again and again. Cameras that work fine for weeks suddenly malfunction. Trail cameras that capture every deer and bear that passes by somehow never get a clear shot of the massive bipedal figure that left footprints in the mud directly in front of the lens. It's like they know. They understand that these devices are monitoring tools and they're smart enough to avoid them or disable them. There's also the question of population density. If Bigfoot exists, there probably aren't very many of them. Large predators and primates generally need huge territories and significant food resources. A viable population of Bigfoot in the Pacific Northwest might only number a few thousand individuals spread across millions of acres of forest. When you do the math, the chances of a random encounter become vanishingly small. And they don't leave bodies lying around, which is another common objection. Neither do bears, actually. When a bear dies in the forest, scavengers process the carcass in days. Beetles, coyotes, ravens, other bears. Nothing goes to waste. Within weeks, there's nothing left but scattered bones, and those get buried by leaf litter and dispersed by animals looking for calcium. If Bigfoot have similar mortality patterns and their bodies are processed by the same natural systems, there's no reason we'd find remains unless we got incredibly lucky. The closest we get to proof are the footprints, the vocalizations, the occasional glimpse, and now clips like what was posted on Reddit. These are creatures that have survived by being invisible, by reading the forest better than we ever could, by understanding and avoiding the patterns of human activity. That's not evidence they don't exist. It's evidence they're extremely good at existing without being detected. So where does that leave us with this new footage? What do we make of 2 trail camera clips that show, in unprecedented detail, what appears to be a Bigfoot moving through the same forest where the most famous Bigfoot film was shot almost 60 years ago? Here's what I think. I think we're at a tipping point. For decades, the evidence for Bigfoot has been dismissed because it wasn't quite good enough. The Patterson-Gimlin film was too grainy, taken with outdated technology, and involved people who couldn't definitively prove they hadn't staged it. Footprint casts could theoretically be faked. Audio recordings could be misidentified. Eyewitness accounts, no matter how credible, were just stories. But technology has advanced. We have thousands of trail cameras in the woods now, running constantly, capturing everything that moves. We have better video quality, metadata that confirms location and time, platforms where evidence can be shared instantly with millions of people. The barriers to capturing proof have dropped dramatically, and yet the resistance to accepting that evidence remains as strong as ever. People have already decided Bigfoot doesn't exist, and no amount of footage is going to change that for them. They'll find reasons to dismiss it. It's too clear, so it must be fake. It's too blurry, so it proves nothing. The person who posted it has ulterior motives. Someone could have created it with CGI or a costume. The goalposts keep moving. Meanwhile, the people who have had encounters don't need more proof. They know what they saw. My uncle knows he saw a Bigfoot in the Six Rivers National Forest in the 1980s. That forestry ranger knows what he encountered twice in the Cascades. The hundreds of witnesses who report sightings every year aren't looking for validation. They're just trying to make sense of an experience that challenged their understanding of what's possible. I think these trail camera clips from Bluff Creek are significant not because they'll convince skeptics, nothing will, but because they add to the accumulating weight of evidence. They're another data point, another piece in a puzzle that's been forming for centuries. And they come from a location that has historical importance, a place where this phenomenon has been documented repeatedly, a place where the Bigfoot have been seen before and will be seen again. What bothers me is the attitude that we have to prove Bigfoot exists beyond any possible doubt before we can study it seriously. That's backwards. In every other field, when you have persistent reports of something unknown, you investigate. You don't demand absolute proof before you'll look at the evidence. You gather the evidence, analyze it, and form conclusions based on what you find. If we applied the standard of proof demanded for Bigfoot to other rare animals, we'd still be debating whether giant squids exist. People reported seeing massive squid for centuries, but the accounts were dismissed as sailors' tales. It wasn't until a specimen washed up and was photographed that the animal was accepted as real. But in the meantime, the lack of a body didn't stop people from studying the accounts, analyzing the reports, trying to understand what was being seen. That's the approach we should be taking with Bigfoot. Look at the evidence objectively, interview witnesses without mockery, set up camera arrays in hotspot areas and monitor them seriously, analyze footprints, vocalizations, and video footage with the same rigor we'd apply to any other zoological question. And if the evidence keeps pointing in the same direction, that there is a large bipedal primate living in North American forests, then maybe it's time to acknowledge that possibility. The footage that just appeared on Reddit won't settle the debate. Nothing will, at least not until someone captures a Bigfoot or finds unquestionable physical evidence. But it should prompt serious people to take another look at this phenomenon. It should make us question why we're so resistant to considering that something unknown might exist in the vast wilderness areas we rarely venture into. Because if these clips are real, and I think they are, then the implications are profound. It means we share this continent with an intelligent species we've somehow managed to overlook. It means our understanding of North American wildlife is incomplete. It means the indigenous peoples who've been telling us about these creatures for thousands of years were right all along. I can't tell you definitively that Bigfoot exists. I haven't seen one myself, and I'm not going to claim knowledge I don't have. What I can tell you is that the evidence is compelling enough to deserve serious attention. And these new trail camera clips from Bluff Creek are perhaps the best evidence we've seen to date. Look at the first clip again. Watch how the Bigfoot moves through the forest, the way its arms swing, the proportions of the body, the fluid gait. Compare it to the Patterson-Gimlin film. The similarities are striking. Same general location, same type of forest, same style of movement. If someone faked this, they did an incredible job of matching details from footage shot nearly 60 years earlier. And that second clip, with the face visible through the foliage, that level of detail is something we've never had before. The sagittal crest, the facial structure, the way the eyes focus on the camera. Either someone built the most sophisticated Bigfoot costume ever created and deployed it in exactly the right location to get captured by a random trail camera, or this is the real thing. I know which explanation makes more sense to me. But I also know that everyone has to evaluate this evidence for themselves. That's why I'm sharing these clips, along with the context and history that surrounds them. You've heard my uncle's story, you've heard about the Patterson-Gimlin film and the generations of sightings that came before and after it. You've heard about the folklore, the consistent reports, the reasons why these creatures would be so hard to document. Now you've seen the footage. You've seen what was captured in Bluff Creek in January 2026, in the same forest where all of this began back in 1967. You've seen details that have never been visible in Bigfoot footage before. The build, the movement, the face, the behavior of a creature that appears to be exactly what thousands of witnesses have described over the years. What do you think? Is this finally the proof we've been waiting for? Is this clear enough evidence to demand serious investigation? Or will these clips fade into the background noise of the internet, endlessly debated but never definitively resolved, just like every other piece of Bigfoot evidence that came before them? I don't have the answers, but I do have questions. Questions about what's really out there in the forests. Questions about why we're so reluctant to investigate seriously. Questions about what it would mean if we finally proved that Bigfoot is real. Somewhere in the mountains of Northern California, in the Six Rivers National Forest near Bluff Creek, there might be answers to those questions. There might be a population of large, intelligent primates that have managed to remain hidden despite everything we've thrown at them. They might be watching us right now, aware of our cameras and our searches, staying just out of reach like they always have. Or maybe not. Maybe this is all misidentification and wishful thinking and cleverly constructed hoaxes. Maybe the Bigfoot is just a modern myth, kept alive by ambiguous evidence and the human tendency to see patterns where none exist. But I've looked at these clips 100 times now, and every time I watch them, I see something that looks real. I see an animal moving through its habitat, behaving naturally, captured by chance, by a camera it probably didn't know was there. I see something that matches every description I've heard from witnesses over the years. I see what might finally be the evidence we've been looking for. You have to decide for yourself. Watch the footage, read the accounts, consider the history and the context. Think about whether it's more likely that someone created an elaborate hoax in a random forest location, or whether we're finally seeing clear documentation of something that's been there all along. The debate isn't settled. Maybe it never will be. But these clips from Bluff Creek represent something important, either conclusive proof that Bigfoot exists or the most sophisticated hoax ever attempted. Either way, they deserve our attention. What do you think? Is this the real deal? Let me know in the comments because I genuinely want to hear your perspective on this. We might be looking at history being made here, or we might be looking at just another chapter in a mystery that's been unfolding for centuries. Either way, the story of Bigfoot continues, and these clips from January 2026 are now part of that story. The question remains open. The forest keeps its secrets. And somewhere in those mountains, something is walking through the trees, leaving footprints in the mud, captured occasionally on trail cameras by pure chance. Whether we ever prove what it is or not, the mystery endures. But what do you think? I want to hear your thoughts.